Imagine it's June 2023. You're a 32-year-old software engineer in Lagos, Nigeria. You're good at what you do. You work remotely for a European tech company. You earn in euros. You've done everything right. Your parents told you education was the way out. You listened. You studied computer science at the University of Lagos. You taught yourself additional programming languages in your spare time. You applied to hundreds of remote positions until one said yes. You beat the odds. On paper, you're living the new Nigerian dream. A global salary, a Lagos apartment, air conditioning that works, a generator that runs when the power grid fails, which is often. But this morning, you check your bank account. The Naira has moved again, not a little, 20% in 6 weeks. Last year, you could convert your euro salary into enough Naira to live well and save. Now the conversion gives you less every single month. Your landlord wants to renegotiate the lease in dollars. Your parents need help with medical bills that have tripled in local currency terms. The imported medication your mother requires costs 4 times what it did 18 months ago. You did everything right, and you're still losing. You open Twitter, everyone is talking about leaving. Japa, they call it, the Yoruba word for escape. Your friends are applying for visas. Canada, Germany, the UK. The nurses left first, then the doctors, now the engineers. You wonder if you should join them, but you also wonder why. Why, after 60 years of independence, after hundreds of billions in oil revenue, after countless development programs and foreign investments and IMF partnerships and World Bank initiatives, why is the exit door still the only strategy that works? This isn't a story about Nigeria. This is a story about a wall, an invisible wall that developing countries have been running into for 70 years, a wall that doesn't appear on any map, a wall that most economists refuse to name because naming it would require admitting that the global economic system isn't a ladder, it's a ceiling. Here's the uncomfortable truth that development economics tries very hard not to say out loud. The global financial system was not designed to help poor countries become rich. It was designed to help rich countries stay rich. This is not conspiracy theory. This is structural analysis. Every decade, we hear about the next wave of emerging markets that will converge with developed economies. Every decade, we're told that globalization, free trade, and foreign investment will lift billions out of poverty. Every decade, the same pattern repeats. A few countries break through. The vast majority do not. The ones that break through did something very specific. The ones that didn't were told not to do that exact thing. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The countries that successfully developed, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and now China, violated nearly every rule in the free market playbook. They protected infant industries. They directed credit. They controlled capital. They strategically copied foreign technology. They put the state at the center of industrialization. The countries that followed the rules, that opened their markets early, that privatized on schedule, that removed capital controls when told to, that welcomed foreign ownership without conditions, those countries are still waiting for convergence that never arrives. This isn't accidental, it's structural. And the structure was designed. The official story goes like this. Developing countries are poor because of internal problems. Corruption, bad governance, lack of education, cultural barriers to entrepreneurship, weak institutions, poor infrastructure. If they would just reform, if they would just follow the right policies, they would grow. The rich countries grew because they had good institutions, rule of law, and free markets. If developing countries copy these policies, they too will grow. Development is a ladder. Every country is on a rung. Climb the ladder by doing the right things. It's that simple. This is what generations of economics students have been taught. It's also a profound misreading of history. Let me show you what the ladder actually looks like. In 1960, per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa was about 11% of US per capita income. 60 years later, after independence, after structural adjustment, after the Washington Consensus, after debt relief, after billions in foreign aid, that number is still around 11%. Not convergence, stagnation. In Latin America, the picture is similar. In 1980, the average Latin American earned about 27% of what an average American earned. Today, after 4 decades of liberalization, privatization, and trade openness, the number is roughly 25%. Not convergence, divergence. Now look at East Asia. South Korea went from a per capita income lower than Ghana's in 1960 to surpassing Spain by 2000. Taiwan did the same. China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 40 years. What did East Asia do differently? They broke the rules. Here's the mechanism that development economics doesn't want to explain clearly. There is something called the middle income trap. Countries get to a certain level of development, typically when wages rise enough to lose cheap labor advantages, and then they stop growing. They never reach high income status. They stay stuck. This is presented as a puzzle, a mystery, something to study. But it's not a mystery, it's a designed outcome. The global economy is organized into tiers. At the top are the countries that design, finance, and brand products. At the bottom are countries that extract raw materials. In the middle are countries that assemble products designed elsewhere. Moving between these tiers is not simply a matter of policy, it's a matter of power, and the countries at the top actively defend their position. Let me be specific. Every developing country that wants to participate in global trade must acquire US dollars. Dollars are needed to buy oil, dollars are needed to import machinery, dollars are needed to service debt, dollars are needed to maintain investor confidence. This creates a structural dependency that no domestic policy can overcome. Here's how it works. A developing country wants to grow. To grow, it needs to import capital goods, machinery, technology, industrial equipment. But it can only buy these goods with dollars. It doesn't earn enough dollars from exports because its exports are mostly raw materials with volatile prices. So it borrows dollars. Now it has debt denominated in a currency it doesn't control. When global interest rates rise, as they did in the early 1980s and again in 2022, the cost of this debt explodes. When the dollar strengthens, the burden grows. When commodity prices fall, export revenue shrinks. The country enters a balance of payments crisis. It cannot pay its debts. It cannot import. It cannot maintain its currency. This isn't bad luck. This is the architecture. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates based on American economic conditions. When America needs to fight inflation, it raises rates. When rates rise, capital flows out of developing countries and into U.S. assets. This strengthens the dollar. This weakens developing country currencies. This makes their dollar debts more expensive. This triggers crises. In 1982, the Volcker shock, the Federal Reserve raising rates to 20% to kill American inflation, triggered the Latin American debt crisis. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Peru. One by one, they defaulted. Economies contracted by double digits. A decade of development was erased. Economists called it the lost decade. Think about what that means. The American Central Bank, acting to solve an American problem, detonated a depression across an entire continent. Countries that had done nothing wrong, that had borrowed in good faith, at interest rates that were low at the time, were destroyed by a policy decision made in Washington. This was not an accident. This is how the system transfers risk. When developing countries enter crisis, they turn to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF provides emergency loans. But these loans come with conditions. The conditions are always the same. Cut government spending, privatize state assets, remove subsidies, open markets to foreign goods, eliminate capital controls, and let the currency float. These policies have a name: structural adjustment. Structural adjustment was imposed on dozens of countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia between 1980 and 2000. The results were consistent. In Ghana, structural adjustment required the removal of food subsidies. The price of basic goods tripled, malnutrition rates spiked. In Jamaica, structural adjustment required the privatization of public utilities. Electricity prices soared. The telecommunications monopoly was sold to foreign investors at a fraction of its value. In Argentina, structural adjustment required pegging the peso to the dollar. When the peg became unsustainable, the economy collapsed. In 2001, GDP fell by nearly 11% in a single year. Poverty doubled. The middle class was erased. In every case, the medicine was the same. In every case, the patient got sicker. But here is the detail that most people miss. The IMF conditions were not designed to help developing countries develop. They were designed to ensure debt repayment. Every policy, privatization, trade liberalization, spending cuts, was oriented toward one goal: making sure creditors got paid. The creditors were banks in New York and London. Structural adjustment was not development policy. It was debt collection dressed up as development policy. Let me tell you about infant industry protection. Every country that successfully industrialized, Britain, America, Germany, Japan, South Korea, did so behind tariff walls. They protected their young industries from foreign competition until those industries were strong enough to compete. Britain invented the cotton textile industry behind tariffs that blocked Indian cloth. America industrialized behind the highest tariff walls in the world for nearly a century. Germany created its chemical and steel industries with state support and trade protection. Japan rebuilt its economy after World War II using industrial policy, directed credit, and careful trade management. This is not disputed history. This is documented history. But here is what happened next. After World War II, the countries that had already industrialized created a new international trade system. They created the GATT, which later became the World Trade Organization. They wrote rules that made it illegal for developing countries to do what they themselves had done. Tariffs were labeled as inefficient. Subsidies were classified as market distortions. Industrial policy was called corruption by another name. The latter was pulled up. The rules that allowed rich countries to get rich were removed from the playbook before poor countries could use them. This is what economist Ha Jun Chang calls kicking away the ladder. The developed world climbed to prosperity using one set of policies, then told everyone else those policies don't work. And the countries that listened, that opened their markets early, that eliminated tariffs as advised, that welcomed unrestricted foreign investment, those countries found their infant industries crushed before they could mature, their farmers undercut by subsidized American agriculture, their manufacturers outcompeted by established multinationals, their markets captured before they could capture them for themselves. Now let's talk about resources. There's a theory in development economics called the resource curse. Countries with abundant natural resources, oil, minerals, precious metals, tend to have slower economic growth, more corruption, and weaker institutions than countries without resources. This is presented as a paradox, a mystery. But it's not a paradox. It's a designed extraction system. Here's how it works. A developing country discovers oil. Foreign companies arrive with the technology and capital to extract it. They negotiate contracts with the government. The contracts are complex, hundreds of pages of legal text drafted by lawyers from New York and London. The terms guarantee the foreign companies a profit regardless of oil prices. They require the country to provide security, infrastructure, and tax breaks. They allow the companies to repatriate profits in dollars. They include arbitration clauses that allow disputes to be settled by international tribunals, not local courts. The oil flows out, dollars flow in, but not many and not for long. A small elite captures the revenue. The currency strengthens, making other exports uncompetitive. This kills agriculture and manufacturing. The economy becomes dependent on a single commodity. When oil prices fall, the country enters crisis. This happened to Nigeria, to Venezuela, to Angola, to Ecuador, to dozens of countries rich in resources and poor in outcomes. The oil was extracted, the profits were repatriated. The country was left with a hole in the ground and debt on its books. This is not a curse, this is extraction by design. Now let me show you what happens when countries refuse to follow the rules. In 1961, South Korea was poorer than Sudan. Per capita income was $82. The country had few natural resources. It had been devastated by war. American aid kept it afloat. 50 years later, South Korea was a high-income country with globally dominant industries in steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, semiconductors, and consumer electronics. How? The Korean government directed the economy. It picked industries. It created massive conglomerates, the chaebol, and fed them cheap credit. It protected them from foreign competition with tariffs and quotas. It controlled capital flows. It negotiated technology transfers. It suppressed wages to keep exports competitive. None of this was free market economics. It was strategic industrial policy. It was the state choosing winners. The same pattern appears in Taiwan. The same pattern appears in Singapore. The same pattern appears most dramatically in China. In 1980, China's per capita income was lower than India's. Today, China is the world's largest manufacturer, the largest exporter, and the second largest economy. It did this by doing exactly what the Washington Consensus said not to do: state-owned enterprises, capital controls, currency manipulation, forced technology transfers, infant industry protection, trade surpluses by design. China didn't follow the rules. China wrote its own rules. And the development community, which spent decades telling poor countries that free markets were the only path to prosperity, had no explanation for why the most successful development story in human history was built on the opposite of their advice. This is where it breaks. Let me be precise about who benefits from this system. The developed world's corporations benefit. They gain access to cheap labor, raw materials, and consumer markets without competition from local firms. Pharmaceutical companies patent medicines developed from traditional knowledge and sell them back at 1,000% markup. Agricultural conglomerates dump subsidized products on markets that can't compete. The developed world's banks benefit. They lend dollars to countries that have no choice but to borrow. They collect interest regardless of whether the loans help the borrower develop. When loans default, the IMF steps in with bailouts that go directly to the creditors. The developed world's consumers benefit. They buy cheap goods made by workers earning $2 a day. The true cost of production, environmental destruction, labor exploitation, political repression, is externalized to countries too weak to demand better. The small elite in developing countries benefits. The politicians who sign the contracts, the businessmen who facilitate the deals, the military officers who provide security. They get rich. They send their children to schools in London and New York. They keep their money in banks in Switzerland and Singapore. This is not a conspiracy. This is an incentive structure. The system pays the people who keep it running. The price is paid by everyone else. It's paid by the farmer in Senegal who can't compete with subsidized European tomatoes. It's paid by the garment worker in Bangladesh who earns $95 a month making clothes that sell for $50 each in Paris. It's paid by the miner in the Congo who extracts cobalt for smartphone batteries and dies of lung disease at 40. It's paid by the nurse in the Philippines who trains at government expense and then emigrates to Canada, leaving a hospital understaffed. It's paid by the child in Nigeria who could have been an engineer, but there are no jobs because there are no industries, because industrialization was never allowed to happen. It's paid by generations, plural. The structural wall doesn't kill quickly. It doesn't create dramatic famines or spectacular collapses. It simply prevents development from ever arriving, year after year, decade after decade. The gap doesn't close. The promises don't materialize. The ladder stays out of reach, and every year, more young people decide that leaving is the only rational choice. The brain drain accelerates, the dependency deepens, the wall gets higher. Think about what that means. Here's the trap. A developing country today faces a set of constraints that make the old paths to industrialization nearly impossible. First, trade rules. The WTO agreements prohibit the tariffs and subsidies that earlier developers used. A country that protects its infant industries faces retaliation, sanctions, and exclusion from markets. Second, investment treaties. Bilateral investment agreements allow foreign companies to sue governments in international arbitration if policies change in ways that affect their profits. Egypt was ordered to pay $2 billion to a mining company for reversing a privatization. Pakistan was ordered to pay $6 billion for denying a mining license on environmental grounds. These treaties bind policy for decades. Third, debt. Most developing countries carry debt denominated in dollars. This limits their ability to stimulate their economies because spending increases demand for imports, which drains foreign currency reserves, which threatens the ability to service debt. Fiscal policy is constrained by external obligations. Fourth, capital mobility. In a world of free capital flows, money moves instantly. If a developing country does something investors dislike, raises corporate taxes, strengthens labor laws, regulates foreign ownership, capital flees. The currency collapses. The crisis arrives. The only way to avoid this vulnerability is to impose capital controls. But capital controls require surveillance, enforcement capacity, and political will that most developing countries don't have. Fifth, the technology gap. Modern industries, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, artificial intelligence, require decades of knowledge accumulation, massive R&D investment, and access to equipment that is controlled by a handful of companies in a handful of countries. The United States, Japan, and the Netherlands control the semiconductor supply chain so tightly that they can and do exclude entire countries from access. At this point, there are only three options for a developing country. One, play by the rules and hope for the best. This means slow growth, commodity dependence, and permanent middle-income status. Two, break the rules as China did. This requires size, state capacity, and geopolitical leverage that most countries don't have. Three, accept permanent dependency and manage decline. None of them are painless. That's the trap. The system isn't broken. The system is working exactly as designed. It was designed by the victors of World War II to rebuild their own economies and secure access to resources and markets worldwide. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, were created by American and British planners to entrench a global order that served American and British interests. This is not interpretation. This is documented history. The archives are open. The memos are public. The intentions were explicit. The American negotiators at Bretton Woods in 1944 designed a dollar-based system precisely because it would give the United States permanent advantage. The British negotiators, led by John Maynard Keynes, proposed an alternative, a neutral international currency called the Bancor, managed by a global institution. America rejected it. The dollar won. From that moment forward, every country in the world would need dollars to participate in the global economy. And dollars could only be obtained by running trade surpluses with the United States, borrowing from American banks, or attracting American investment. The post-war order was not a gift, it was a claim. And when developing countries challenged that claim, when they nationalized resources, demanded better terms, or sought independent paths, they were disciplined. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, the Congo in 1961, Chile in 1973. The list is long. The system defends itself. We are entering a period of global fragmentation. The US-China rivalry is reshaping supply chains. Climate change is making resource extraction more contested. Debt levels in the developing world are at historic highs. The dollar remains dominant, but alternatives are emerging. Some analysts see opportunity in this chaos. Perhaps the old rules are breaking down. Perhaps new paths are opening. Maybe. But history suggests caution. Every previous moment of systemic disruption, the end of colonialism, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the end of the Cold War, was accompanied by promises that the developing world's moment had finally arrived. Each time, the structural wall held. New institutions replaced old ones. New rules replaced old rules. New mechanisms of extraction replaced old mechanisms. The faces changed. The architecture remained. The question isn't whether this time is different. The question is, different for whom? The software engineer in Lagos is still watching the Naira collapse. The farmer in Senegal is still competing with subsidized European exports. The miner in the Congo is still dying for someone else's battery. The wall is still there. It doesn't appear on any map, but it shows up in the data, in the stagnation, in the gap that never closes. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. It is not investment guidance. It is an attempt to understand the structures that shape economic outcomes across borders and generations. Closing. The pattern has been in motion for 70 years. It was designed into the post-war order. It was reinforced by the debt crises of the 1980s. It was codified in the trade agreements of the 1990s. It is maintained today by the architecture of dollar dominance, investor protection treaties, and technology monopolies. Some countries broke through. They did so by breaking the rules at moments when geopolitical circumstances allowed it. They were the exceptions that proved the rule. For everyone else, the wall remains. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't generate headlines. It simply ensures that the gap between rich and poor countries persists, decade after decade, despite all the conferences and initiatives and programs designed to close it. The question isn't if developing countries will catch up. The question is whether the system was ever designed to let them. History suggests an answer. But history is still being written. This channel exists to study the mechanisms before they become obvious. Most people never see these structures until their effects arrive. If you want to understand how systems really work, not how they're supposed to work, but how they actually function, consider subscribing. The next pattern is already in motion.